Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before we begin this meeting, may I ask everyone to silence your cell phones? The Bend ISD, the Board of Trustee meeting is an open meeting for the public to address the board conducting district business. Therefore, audience members may address the board during the designated audience items section on the agenda. If you have any printed materials you want to give to the board members, you must provide them to the board secretary, Norma Perez, or to me, and we will provide them to the board. We also ask that the members of the audience be respectful of others, remain quiet during the meeting so that everyone is able to hear the proceedings. For your convenience, microphones have been provided on both sides of the boardroom. Please speak directly into the microphones if you ask to answer a question or address the board during the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Officer Ontiveros. The time is 6:01 p.m. and this meeting is hereby called to order. We have the presence of a quorum, and the meeting has been duly called, and notice of the meeting has been posted for the time and manner required by law. Please rise for the pledges of allegiance and remain standing for the silent invocation. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible. Please remain standing for a silent invocation. You may be seated. First on the agenda are audience items. Each audience member that signed up will have 3 minutes to speak. Mr. Rosenthal will keep time and he will let you know when you have 30 seconds remaining. First up is Tammy Marino.
Hi everyone. Tonight I am counting on you, our elected Board of Trustees, to stand up for our gifted and talented students. The GT Task Force was established to research and develop plans while working with the Parent Advisory Committee, whose role would be to communicate with the task force and relay info back to their communities. We did everything we were asked to do, even when agendas seemed off base, even when we didn't have any contact whatsoever with the PAC. We worked hard and we worked between meetings to ensure we kept the needle moving forward and we were able to meet often unrealistic deadlines. When we last met in May for a 5.5-hour work session, we refined our draft of policy and finalized drafts of regulations. We discussed the handbook and the need for extensive work on that document. We were told we would play an active role in that revision process. We left never questioning we would all meet again. Quote, as I stated at our first meeting, this is not a 1 year and be done with it task force. This will take several years. That's a direct quote from Troy Byrne, who's been a staunch supporter of our GT kids and a strong leader for the task force. He assured us time and time again our work would be long but very worthwhile. Quote, handbook revisions will be a topic once meetings resume for 18-19. That's a direct quote from an email from Clarissa Rodriguez in July 25th of this year. These are just two of many communications the task force received over our time as a working group, indicating ours was not a short-term commitment. It seems to me that it was our questioning about the policy that was presented to the board last week without any task force notification that led to admin blindsiding us with the news that our work is done. At what was supposed to be a meeting to discuss where communication balls had gotten dropped, we were told quite coolly we would no longer be meeting. We weren't told who would take over the work. We were invited to attend 4 PAC meetings where we can get updates. It was an insulting and very scary slap across the face. Please don't allow admin to stop the task force train now that we're rolling and before we arrive at our destination. I have 4 kids in this district. My oldest focuses solely on her electives because her core classes are not inspiring. My new high school freshman had breakdowns last year where she truly wanted to drop out of school because she could get and keep her 98 average without trying and she didn't feel challenged. In just the past week, I've heard stories of involved engaged families pulling anywhere from 1 to all of their kids out of Fort Bend because of an utter frustration with the lack of GT services. Some made their final decision last week after hearing task force members' passionate pleas to the board to finally hold admin accountable for real and meaningful improvements to our program. Parents are pulling their students out, students who had their natural curiosity and zest for learning stolen from them. It doesn't matter how big of a bond you pass. If we aren't giving our students what they need in terms of challenges and experiences, we will keep losing students, and we will likely lose a lot of bond votes as well. Please don't vote on policy that hasn't been properly vetted. Please don't allow admin to break apart a successful working group before their mission is complete. Please do the right thing for our GT kids.
Thank you, Mrs. Marino. Next is Angie Hannon.
Board President Burdine, Board of Trustees Dr. Dupree. I have one 7th grader who attends the GT Academy. She's identified in all areas. I'm also the current president of PACE. At the beginning of my child's school career, the kindergarten GT teacher explained to parents that even if kids come to kindergarten reading, they don't know what it means. The teacher's depressing and inaccurate comment foreshadowed an elementary career that lacked access to challenging and meaningful learning opportunities for my daughter and others like her. Her 1st grade teacher told me she didn't have time to work with my child because the rest of the class was so low. The principal refused to allow her to work with other GT students in other grade levels, even though she was the only one identified in her grade level. Getting nowhere, I transferred my child to another school the next year. My daughter did not fare much better at her 2nd school. Dr. Indelicato and the assistant director of C&I joined me and my husband for a meeting with the principal. I felt 100% supported by them. However, in the long term, very little improved. During my daughter's elementary school, she had 2 principals who denied her and others like her access to a challenging and appropriate education commensurate with their abilities. These same 2 principals at different schools blatantly disregarded the district's own regulations regarding program placement. Moving forward, the district needs strong, clear, local policy because EHBBR and EEAR are hidden from parents, and parents are not adequately informed of what the GT program in this district is expected to look like. Do not approve EHBB local as it sits in front of you tonight. It is not clearly articulated and does not represent what the task force recommended. The reassessment piece inspires inequity in program access. The learning opportunities section with its new learning plan component is incomplete and does not even state who writes the learning plan. Administration refuses to add program evaluation and community awareness sections, although many Texas districts have these sections. Administration may tell you that BI local meets that annual program evaluation recommendation found in the state plan, but they are mistaken. Read BI local and you will see this. The mission of Texas public education system is to ensure that all Texas children have access to quality education that enables them to achieve their full potential, and Fort Bend ISD's local policy AE echoes that mission by more narrowly defining its own mission, core beliefs, and its profile of a graduate. If you truly believe
30 seconds.
that you exist to inspire and equip all students to pursue futures beyond what they can imagine, I hope in the coming weeks you will stop and ask the kids what they imagine school should be like now, not just what they imagine their futures to be. I have one more request, is that you publicly notify parents when administration provides you with a GT update in the coming weeks. I know parents will want to know what the 3-year plan looks like. I hope too that the administration presents the plan. There will actually be something implemented in years 2 and 3 regarding curriculum and program design. The draft version presented August 9th had nothing there. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Mrs. Karen Cunningham.
Dr. Dupree, President and Trustees, thank you so much for your time and your service to this district. My name is Karen Mayer Cunningham. I'm a special education advocate serving countless families in this great school district of Fort Bend ISD. I've been notified that reevaluations weren't being done in this school district, and it was actually a training. And when I heard that, I told my families that's not true. That's not even possible. Yet before you, in the contents that you have in your packet, there is ample proof. The first says a district email was sent out to 100 evaluators. First point says required special education reevaluations for students will be delayed. Number 2, required special education services to children with disabilities will be delayed. Number 3, district is out of compliance for initial evals Should you have initial evals, you should do 5th and 8th graders first. The second is an additional district training. District only reports to TEA initial evaluations for compliance. This district's at 75%. Again, it reiterates that reevaluations continue to be out of compliance, and thus services for children with disabilities are not delivered. Action forms for out-of-compliance reevaluations is to be reprioritized, place a behavioral needs student in special ed above an academic student in special ed if their reevaluation is out of compliance. Third, before you have a district training confirming that reevaluations continue to be out of compliance. This covers a 3-year school plan. TEA student, fourth is TEA student performance indicators confirming that child find, which is initial evaluations for students with disabilities, has never been met in this district for 3 years. No district gets to delay students in special education. They're required triennial reevaluation. It drives everything good and right that we do for students with disabilities. No district gets to delay students with special education their services. We have 3 request items for the board. A 3-year audit of the special education department addressing delaying required reevaluations, training providers to delay them, and delaying special needs students their services. Number 2, an action plan presented to the public of a corrective measure for this practice. And number 3, a compensatory plan for the students who have been denied FAPE and who have been harmed. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next up is, please hold your applause. Next up is Cliff Wolf.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here to address the fiduciary responsibility of the board of directors. I understand that there are $380 million on the last bond issue that still has not been spent, and I'm sort of at a loss to figure out why we need another $1.7 billion in revenue from tax bonds. I also understand that there are millions of dollars to be spent on computers and software in that bond issue. I'd like a show of hands of you folks that would go to Best Buy, buy a computer and software, go to the checkout stand and say, I want to pay for this with a 27-year banknote. In addition, you have a white fleet replacement on the same bond issue. How many of you drive 30-year-old automobiles? But you're going to finance these automobiles over 30 years? I think that's a little bit absurd too. I just really don't have a lot of faith in the district's ability to spend the taxpayers' money effectively. Case in point, in 2005, I took a diesel catalyst that was invented by Exxon to the transportation department with the agreement that if we achieved a 10% reduction in fuel consumption, that they would put it into effect. It has not gone into effect. To this point, they could have saved well over $1 million, possibly $2 million on their fuel, but they can't find the time to put a program in that would use this catalyst. I really don't understand it. It doesn't seem to me, it seems to me like you guys have a whole lot of time to put a $1.7 billion bond proposal together, but you don't have any time to put together something that would save money. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Up next is Lynn Prince.
Well, thank you for your time. I think this is going to be quick. I'm here because I'm upset. My family had to return from our vacation 2 days early because Fort Bend ISD decided to wait until 7 days before school start to send out extorting emails about having to do forms before you can find out your teacher assignment. And so I wanted the board to know and to recognize that withholding teacher assignments, withholding test scores and test reports, withholding field trip information, withholding GT information, all of that goes against your so-called goal to promote equitable access to curriculum. It also is in violation of state and federal laws. Parents and students have a right to access their information, and you don't get to hold it hostage for unknown reasons that are just completely unnecessary, forms that could be filled out the first day of school or after school. I'm nervous, and I've not done this before, and I didn't write anything, so forgive me. But you don't get to hold people hostage and tell people when they have to come home to do, fill out forms, or you can only find out your teacher name at the meet and greet if you do XYZ in our library. All that is unnecessary. If there's any form that you would like filled out, if a parent asks you for a copy of that form so they can have it reviewed, please provide it. If a parent asks you for information about the GT program, please provide it. There's no reason for any parent to be retaliated against or any student to be retaliated against and information to be withheld from them. You guys have a problem in this district at some of these schools, and I'm just here to get my problem on the record so that no one can say that they didn't hear about it in advance. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Up next is Courtney Cobble.
Dr. Dupree and school board members, my name is Courtney Cobble. I went to school in Fort Bend ISD, and when I had children, my husband and I moved back to Fort Bend County so our children could attend school here. I am here today because the Safety Advisory Committee has been considering arming teachers through the Guardian or Marshal programs. I want to make it clear that people in this community do not want that to happen. Guns have no place in our schools, which are meant to be places of sanctuary, safety, and learning for children. I don't want my children to think their teacher needs to carry a gun for them to be safe, and mostly I don't want them to be at an increased risk of becoming a victim of gun violence because their teacher is armed. How many problems can you solve by adding more of the problem? More guns in schools leads to more gun violence in schools. No amount of training can eliminate human error. Mistakes happen. We do not want them to happen with a gun in a school. Recently, a teacher in California who is also a reserve police officer accidentally discharged a firearm, injuring a student. In Virginia, a school resource officer also inadvertently discharged his gun in a school. And in Pennsylvania, an armed teacher left her loaded gun in an elementary school bathroom. 4 children used that single stall bathroom before an adult was notified of the gun. A few questions to consider. If teachers are armed and there's an active shooter, when police arrive, how will they know the good guys from the bad guys? This puts our teachers and any students nearby at extreme risk. If a fight breaks out in a school, can we ensure an armed teacher won't draw their gun on our own students? Will their training really be enough for them to stay level-headed in a situation that now involves a weapon, no matter whose hands it may be in? If teachers are wearing a gun on their body, students will know which teachers are armed. What's to stop a student from taking that gun from the teacher or a group of students from overwhelming them? That problem is compounded by Governor Abbott's effort to do away with keeping guns in safes for the Marshal program. He's also trying to reduce the amount of training they receive. The students will know where the guns are, and those guns will not be secured. Our teachers are trained to be educators, not bodyguards. They have enough to worry about in school. Constantly worrying about where their gun is shouldn't be one of them. Arming teachers will also lead to higher costs. There are costs for training, firearms, ammunition, storage. Higher, though, is the cost of insurance. The Oregon School Board Association announced an increase in insurance premiums for every armed staff member. And following Sandy Hook, Kansas decided to allow arming staff. However, their insurer announced they would not cover any school that allows guns. School safety and insurance experts agree that adding a firearm to a classroom only increases the risk of gun violence. As a parent with children in your district, I desperately want our children to be safe, but guns in our schools is not the way. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Next, we have our information items. We are starting with the internal audit update. Dr. Dupree.
Yes, sir. Greg Gibson is here to provide the update on 2 internal audits that were completed during the last year.
Board President Burdine, members of the board, Dr. Dupree, it's my pleasure to be here tonight to present the results of 2 internal audits that we conducted during the past fiscal year. We are proud to be part of the school board's continuous improvement effort through their internal audit program. This is our 6th year of involvement with Fort Bend ISD, and we are very pleased to be here and very pleased to be part of this program. So tonight we are going to discuss two audits. There is a human resources follow-up audit, and follow-up audits are a little bit different from the original audit that was conducted in HR in 2015. So a follow-up audit is just that. We're following up to see what the status is of the recommendations that were recommended. And then second is a special education audit, which was conducted this past year. And there will be room, plenty of time for questions. So I'm Greg Gibson. I'm the project director. I'm the president of the firm. I'm the program director for the internal audit program. And I wanted to also acknowledge the other members of our project teams for these two assignments. Carrie Monkwitz was the project director for the, and the lead consultant for the special ed internal audit. Ken Ingram was the lead human resources auditor. Cheyenne Roth is both the project manager for both of these projects, as well as the program manager for the audit committee. And we had one subcontractor that worked with us on the special education audit, Dr. Cindy Ellsbury. I'm going to talk about the human resources follow-up audit first. This audit was initially completed in May 2015, and while the Human Resource Department is not a large department, it is responsible for human resources, and personnel costs represent more than 80% of expenditures in a school system. So the Human Resource Department is very important. And so it was next in the cycle to be audited in 2015, and so this year the board requested us to do a follow-up audit. These are the different functional areas that were covered in the initial audit. I'm not going to read through them, but I just wanted to refamiliarize the board with the topical areas that are included in an HR audit. This pie chart summarizes our results for the HR follow-up audit. So as you can see that there are, of the 23 recommendations, 21 were acted on. There were 2 that the administration disagreed with. Neither one of those had to do with compliance risks or performance risks. But we evaluated the progress on the other 21 where the district decided to take action. And so 8 were complete, 4 were substantially complete, 8 were partially complete, and 1 was not complete, or not much action had happened on that. I'm going to go through a couple of these. I'm not going to go through every recommendation, but I wanted to highlight a few of those, and I'm going to skip a page to recommendation 6. This recommendation was to secure immediately and protect the confidentiality of personnel files and folders in the file room in the HR department. This was only partially complete, and what we learned during the process was that the HR department is actually planning to move, and at this date they may have already moved, but there were some stopgap measures that we were hoping that would have taken place to provide additional security. There were some security measures implemented with respect to the files, but the facility change, or the anticipated facility change, was why more effort or more progress wasn't made on this particular recommendation. I'm going to skip over to recommendation 11, the job descriptions. This is a recommendation where we found that a lot of job descriptions hadn't been updated district-wide in several years. And so we recommended that there be a process implemented to do this. And the district, the HR department, started this process and was pretty far into the process of getting this done, but the results had not yet been achieved. There were still quite a few job descriptions that were remaining. So while there was some effort that had been undertaken in the past several years, the results that we hope would have been achieved have not been achieved yet, but it's certainly going that direction. I'm going to skip over to recommendation 17, implement strategies and incentives that are effective in reducing absences among teachers. The district actually looked at how it was capturing absences and differentiating absences for different purposes. And so that resulted in a different set of analyses that was done internally by the district. So there has been some effort. Again, teacher absences in some schools have gone up, in other schools they've gone down. And so, again, we haven't seen the results that we might have expected to see, but again, the district was taking steps to remedy the situation. There were several recommendations that had to do with technology and being more efficient, and some of those the district was able to complete, and others were not able to be completed, in part because the district is contemplating new information systems, major new information systems, and so until those decisions were made, some of the decisions affecting the human resource department efficiency and technology were dependent on that and could not be made yet. Those were really the only recommendations I wanted to highlight. I'll pause there to see if there are any questions related to the HR audit before I start on special education.
Go ahead. Thank you, sir.
All right. I will proceed. These are the major areas that were addressed in the special education audit: departmental organization and management, student identification, evaluation and placement, and program service delivery. These are really broad areas. If you look at the introduction to the internal audit report, there are many questions and subtopics that are discussed under each of these items, but they all rolled up into these areas. Also, there was, we did an IEP audit, Individualized Education Program audit, where we selected a sample of IEP files and went through those and evaluated them for compliance, completeness, academic rigor, and such. The special education program in Fort Bend ISD, as in any school system, is a major program. We serve 6,000 students with 1,500 employees at a budget of $85 million a year. It's the big and very important program. It's also very complex to manage from a regulatory standpoint, as there are federal laws, mostly federal laws, that dictate this, but also state laws. The kind of the themes I wanted to get across to you in this presentation tonight was, one, this program is a really good example of self-continuous improvement. There have been a lot of changes and a lot of improvements over the past several years in special ed program, and this was a result of the district taking a look at itself, taking a hard look at itself, making some difficult decisions, some changes that actually work to improve that. So we acknowledged a lot of these through commendations in this report. There are quite a few commendations that acknowledge the practices, and it wasn't just that the practices being implemented were good. We actually saw evidence of results in some of the outcome indicators. Your end of course scores were up, your graduation rates were up, your dropout rates were down for special ed students with disabilities. And so this is a good, anybody that can look at their own department themselves critically and make kind of an objective assessment and make changes as a result of that is really noteworthy, and I wanted to point that out. That being said, there are still areas for improvement. There are a number of recommendations in the report that relate to implementation fidelity. So while we've made progress in defining programs, new programs and activities, we're not consistently implementing them across the district. And so implementation fidelity is really challenging because we can't be out there watching everybody do everything all the time. We do have observation protocols and observation sessions where we do observe what's going on in these classrooms. But implementation fidelity relates to several areas. In addition to implementation, IEPs, behavior intervention plans. These are examples, and there are more examples discussed in the report, but implementation fidelity was one of the major areas of concern that we found in this audit. Technology was another area that we thought where Fort Bend ISD was a little behind with respect to students with disabilities. And one aspect of that is instructional technology, and there are initiatives already underway to improve instructional technology for students with disabilities, but also the technology devices. As a student goes through an IEP process, or the IEP is developed, technology equipment or devices are identified, and we found a lot of these to be devices that were used a decade or two ago, and we provided a list of more current devices that can be used or that are available, and we just didn't see a lot of the more current devices that are available for students with disabilities. So like the human resource audit, I'm not going to go through every single recommendation or commendation, but there were a couple of commendations that I wanted to point out to you. The organization structure for the special ed program was pretty significantly overhauled several years ago, and somewhat of a house cleaning. I mean, it was basically not only reorganizing and changing titles, but we got a lot of new faces in to run this program. The special education school report cards, we provided samples of those in the report. It's the first time we've seen these. These are really good, and it really helps the principals and other people to schools stay connected to what's going on with student achievement with respect to their students with disabilities. The 2015 a redesign of services, this was the initiative that kind of prompted a lot of these changes that we saw over the past 3 years. So we wanted to commend that. Changes to the initial evaluation process to improve equity in referral and evaluation practices. These have resulted in increased number of referrals and a higher percentage of students with disabilities relative to the total student population. So what this also means is our program is growing, and as it's growing, the resources become somewhat strained because our funding's not growing. And so when a department within a program, any department grows, then there are natural resource constraints that department has to face. Another commendation, there have been increases in the percentage of students served in what's called least restrictive environments. This is a federal requirement that the students are served in the least restrictive environment that's possible or practical. And these percentages have been going up for Fort Bend over the last several years. I spoke about the walkthroughs, the accommodations and exemplars for modifications embedded within the general curriculum. The more connected special education is with general education, the better for those kids. And so we saw evidence of that. Some of the recommendations we made, again, I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to talk about the second one on this page. These recommendations are listed here with some bullet points, and at the end, they're listed just by themselves, with a recommendation number and a priority assignment. So I'm going to go through this list, but I just want you to know that that list is available at the end of the presentation. The second recommendation on this page is to reduce paraprofessionals in favor of certified teachers. We saw the pupil-teacher ratio going up and the pupil-aide ratio going down in special education. So that meant we have fewer teachers relative to our student population, but our student population's been growing, so it's not like we've been reducing teachers. We just haven't been able to add teachers as fast as our student growth. But we are adding aides, and we have quite a few aides in the special education program. And aides are not certified teachers. They're important. We're not saying that aides are not important, but we suggest that the district evaluate whenever we're getting ready to add an aide position to evaluate whether or not a teaching position would be better than a few of the aide positions. I'm going to skip over to the second recommendation on slide 19. continue to redesign RTI and provide additional targeted supports to schools. RTI was one of the areas where it still wasn't being implemented consistently across the school district. This is not an uncommon problem in schools, not just Texas schools, but schools all over. RTI is very important. It's not actually part of the special education program. It's actually a general education program that's a pre-referral intervention strategies to try to help students and actually prevent them from needing special education services unless they meet the criteria for special ed. But the referral process between RTI and the actual service in special education wasn't working as well, and so they redesigned the referral process. And so the referral piece of that seems to be working well now. The RTI process still isn't consistent across schools. The direct services and reevaluations are provided in accordance with student IEPs. The next recommendation, this was mentioned earlier tonight, the shortage of LSSPs has resulted in some services there being a delay in reevaluations. And so the reevaluations are required every 3 years, and there have been some staffing situations that have prevented that. So we noted this in our audit that not all evaluations or reevaluations were being conducted when they should, and that the district will need to address that likely through the addition of more staff resources. Recommendation 2 on the following slide, provide more guidance and support to schools to implement the co-teaching model. I think there's a presentation later tonight on co-teaching. The district has implemented co-teaching, and this is again another example of a program that's the right program. We want to be in co-teaching. It is a least restrictive environment instructional arrangement. But we need to be more consistent in how we're implementing this, and the schools may need more support in how they implement that. Also, PBIS, the Positive Behavior Intervention and Supports. This also needs clear expectations to make sure we're not only doing these behavioral services. Again, some of these behavior services are outside of special ed. It's not all special ed programs. But the development of the behavior intervention plans, we found those to be inconsistent as well. And so the expectations for this program needs to be specified to better address the inconsistency. The second recommendation on slide 21, implement strategies to address disproportionate placement for special ed students in school suspension and out of school suspension. We just have a higher, we have higher rates for students with disabilities than students that don't have disabilities. And so the state monitors these percentages, and it's part of the accountability system, and the district's aware of this, and it's a common issue for a lot of school systems. But we offered up some specific strategies that we think might help with this. There are two recommendations on this page that relate to technology. One is the accelerating the use of digital learning, the other one about assistive technology devices that we've already discussed. I think that was all the recommendations I really wanted to speak to specifically. I'm going to pause now and see if there are any questions about this particular audit report.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. We appreciate the presentation. Mrs. Haliger, you have a question?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gibson, for your presentation. Just kind of going over some things. Definitely some of the disproportionate placement alarms me, and I understand, this is a common thing around some districts, but I don't think it needs to be ours. I think this is about procedure. You said that you made some recommendations on how just knowing and going through the process myself with my own kids. I think some of this is process and procedural based and how we implement some of those things that we do have in place. and making sure we stick to what we said we were gonna do. And so I'm not sure what your recommendations are, but around that.
There are just several implementation strategies. I could point you to the page. I'd have to open up my computer.
Okay, I'll look at it again. Okay.
Yeah, we listed, I think, 6 or 7 different strategies that you should.
Yeah. And I guess I was hoping that there was someone from the public who spoke earlier around the evaluations of our kids not being evaluated on the triennial basis. And so I wanted to make sure that the scope of this audit included that, and I believe it did. So tell me if it doesn't, because areas addressed with student identification, evaluation, and placement. So one of the things that she spoke about was that over in her findings, which I'm not sure what her findings are or how she got to her findings. I don't know, but she spoke about that there was an audit provided that it was 3 years where students were not being evaluated, and I don't see that in the presentation.
Yeah, we had a recommendation about that. It was, let me go back to it. Recommendation 8, secure additional staff or services to ensure that direct services are provided in accordance with student IEPs and reevaluations occur within the required 3-year time limitation. So our audit did look into that, and we did identify some exceptions.
Okay, I really just wanted to illuminate that one since it was talked about here in the boardroom. So secure additional staff services, ensure that direct services are provided. Okay, do you want to talk to that? Why are we missing that? Are the numbers of what they what was addressed today?
Good evening. So we knew already going into this audit that we have a challenge with reevaluations. And one of the reasons, and one of the persons that spoke earlier, as well as things that we've talked about, is because we were so low, identified overall for special education, that we just started, making changes to our referral process. So we ended up having so many kids to evaluate for initial evaluations that it pushed our reevaluations back. And so they are delayed at several campuses. And one of the things that I think is important to note is that once a child is already identified and receiving special ed services, an ARD committee can be held at any time and address any deficits or any concerns with the data we have at hand. So what we encourage, although we do acknowledge some of our situations where reevaluation is delayed past the 3-year mark, we encourage our staff to go ahead and have an ARD meeting, take all the data that we have available in front of us, and develop a plan to support the child. So if a child is failing, for example, in reading, and they're not identified as having a learning disability yet in reading, because that is a pending evaluation, go ahead and take the data we have, create a plan to support reading intervention, and give them the services. So we have really worked hard to do that. And so we consider each situation individually. And so if there is a situation where the failure or the 3-year reeval delayed has impacted their services, we do develop a plan for compensatory services. So we feel like we are on the right track to addressing what we know is a difficult situation across the district. And the other way that we've tried to correct that is through adding additional positions. And the board was gracious over the last couple of years to add positions for LSSPs, diagnosticians, and speech paths to help with these evaluations. And we're excited. This is the first time since I've been here that we've been fully staffed with the additional positions for DIAGs, LSSPs, and speech paths as we go into the new year. So we feel like we'll be much better off and be able to catch up on some of the reevaluations.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Helliger. Mrs. Tolsan.
Thank you, Mr. Burdine. So the first thing I wanted to do was thank Dr. Hill and her staff and everyone who works in the special education department, because not only as a board member but as a mom who has struggled in Fort Bend ISD with special education services for many years, I do know that you guys have come in and have worked very hard to overhaul that program. And that's part of the reason that Mr. Burdine, Mr. Rice, and I on the audit committee wanted to have this audit was to make sure that after all of these things have been put in place, to see what's working, what's not working. And so that's why we commissioned the audit as the audit committee. And there, of course, were findings, which we all expected, because especially when you overhaul a system that's really as broken as it was in Fort Bend ISD, you expect to still have challenges to overcome. One of the things I am very glad about is we were under-identifying, as we all know, which is a child fine violation. And you guys have worked very hard to try to improve that. So I just wanted to say that because I've watched the heavy lifting behind the scenes, and I have actually seen in the classroom the improvements. But one of the things that I did want to point out is that obviously the ARD meetings are no replacement for an evaluation or a reevaluation. That's a legal requirement. And we did talk about this in our audit committee meeting, and we fortunately were able to be very involved in even setting some of the parameters for the audit and to make sure we were really digging into all these areas and getting some real results. So I just wanted to ask, and you talked about this a little bit, but I want to make sure that we do know what the district's plan is going forward to ensure that we're not violating the law and we're not violating child fine and violating FAPE. And how are we tracking those compensatory services to make sure that they're getting done? Because one of the things that was found in the audit was that there's no centralized tracking for compensatory services. So if you could address that, I would appreciate it.
So one of the things we've got with our IEP provider to create a supplemental form that will be filled out at the ARD meeting as a way if compensatory services are granted at the ARD meeting, and then we'll be able to track that. Right now we do it on a spreadsheet, but we specifically went to them after the audit and asked if they would do that. And so that's in the process, and we expect that to be out in a couple of months. In the meantime, we'll continue to track those through spreadsheets and make sure that they're happening. And the other thing I'll just say is that, again, we've just done an RFP to look at additional providers. Some of the challenges are being able to find people that we can hire. So as long as we have all of our positions filled, then we may come back and say we need additional positions. But in the past, we haven't been able to get them filled, and we had to use vendors for those. And it's difficult to find vendors that have LSSPs. I mean, they're just not out there in Texas. So we've been creative. We just did an RFP to look for licensed professional counselors so they can do some of the counseling that LSSPs may be not getting to, so that they can focus on evaluation. And we'll continue to just explore, creative ways like that to be able to find the staff that, if they're not employed, to get vendors in to help do the evaluations, because it's twofold. It's one, we have to have people doing the evaluation, and then we have to have people to be able to help implement the services.
So thank you for that. Do we have a plan for catching up? Do we have a timeline?
Well, we feel pretty good about things with these additional positions. There are some implications that have just come out in the past couple of the summer from TEA with dyslexia as it relates to special education, and that is going to impact things some. So, we don't really know until we see how many parents want their child evaluated under IDEA, under special ed, that are currently receiving dyslexia services, and we will be offering those evaluations to parents. So there are some implications that we hadn't planned on prior to July when that was released. But we do feel like with these additional positions that we should be much more caught up. And we're tracking those. Like we had all of our middle schools, which is the main place reevals hit us hard. And we had them almost caught up, at the end of the year last year. So we feel pretty good about that. So, I think we'll know more probably late October, early November, as far as the effect of the dyslexia changes and how that may impact our reevals and our initials.
Okay, thank you. I think it would be a good idea for us to get an update on that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Tossan. Mrs. James.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gibson, for a nice presentation and bringing these audits to us. I want to go back, if I could, Mr. Burdine, to the human resources audit. And I guess I have a question for staff because I'm just kind of looking over this is a follow-up audit, so we've had a couple of years towards, to work towards implementation, and the recommendations that haven't been completed that Mr. Gibson brought up seem to be sort of a lot of high level or high priority recommendations. So I guess I'm wondering what the status of what the situation is. Are we sort of on track as we expected? Are we behind? Why are these high priority recommendations not being followed up on or not really being acted on as high priority? So I guess I'm trying to understand what the plan forward is.
So Gwen is here. I'm going to share executive director of that area, but I will tell you, I'll let her speak specifically to some of them, but I want to make sure it's very clear these are high priorities. We see them as high priorities, and just because they're not completed does not mean we're not following up in an expeditious way. As Mr. Gibson mentioned, some of them simply have to do with the fact we're looking at a new ERP system, which would mean we don't want to invest a lot in a solution that we're going to turn around and walk away from in a couple of years. And then there are some other implications I'll let Gwen get into as well.
Okay, thank you. The audit paralleled our strategic plan development back in 2015, and a lot of the work that we're focused on through the strategic plan is aligned to the work that, or the recommendations that were made in the audit. So work is well underway in the ones that are existing now, and we do have a plan in place to finish the work in these areas for 2018-19. I believe we listed about 7 of those that are to be completed this upcoming school year. In addition to that, we have one that's going to be completed in 1920. We've also identified 7 of the recommendations that do have a technology impact. So we've closed the gap as much as we can, making incremental progress along the way, and kind of had at a point where we need a system that's going to help us get to the finish line on those.
Okay, thank you. So, Dr. Dupree, would it be possible, I don't have those timelines or dates, so I'm not sure which recommendation she's talking about, expected to be finished this year versus next year, whatever. Would it be possible for the board to get that information?
Yes, we can.
Thank you.
I think it's also included in the dashboard that we can put that in a document as well.
Do I have access? I don't think I have access.
Oh, you may not.
Yeah, I'm not on the audit committee, so thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Touche.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Mr. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Burdine. I simply wanted to take a moment to comment on how the internal audit process works here at Fort Bend ISD. We do have an audit committee, and I believe I was appointed the chair of that committee by Mrs. James and continued with Mrs. Tasson, and Mr. Burdine has asked me to continue in that role, but I have respectfully declined to accept because my workload does not allow me to continue to chair that committee, and I believe he's selected Mrs. Tasson to serve in that capacity going forward. But I would like to say that the audit committee works hard with the administration to identify audits that need to be held. Some audits are annual, such as the financial audit. Other audits recur every 3 to 5 years. And the process works like this. Once we determine an audit that needs to be conducted, we also determine the budget every year, and we do probably about 3 to 4 audits a year. And then we have Mr. Gibson and Gibson Consulting come in as an outside independent auditor who is strictly at arm's length, and he is able to bring in experts in various fields, not just special ed and human resources, but also in construction, in maintenance, and food service, and all of the many different areas that we have audited. And that enables him to bring best practices from knowledgeable individuals to bear on these audits. We have been using Mr. Gibson's firm for at least 5 or 6 years with great effect, and as these audits are undertaken, there is a meeting held with the department that's going to be audited, where the rules of the road are laid down, and as the audit unfolds, the administration is always given an opportunity to respond to the comments. They either accept the recommendation, or they may accept a modified recommendation, or they may reject a recommendation, but they will always have their reasons for that. And then the audit is presented as the special education audit was presented this evening to the full board and to the public. And when that happens, it becomes a matter of public record. So it's very transparent, and we bear our challenges, our accomplishments. It's out there for the world to see. Subsequent to that, we will have a follow-up audit, just as we have done on the human resource audit. We'll return to that audit in about 9 months. We'll return to the special ed audit probably in about 9 to 10 months to follow up and identify the progress that's being made, as Mrs. Tasson pointed out, and trust me, she will follow up with that. And the results of the follow-up will also be published, just as the human resources audit was published tonight. So I think it's a very solid process, and we have a lot of audits going on, and it's a lot of work for everyone involved, including the departments. We have to be careful not to overwhelm the departments with audits. It requires a balance, but we are doing our fiduciary responsibility in managing the assets and the financial resources and everything else for the district. I think that's all I had to say on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rice, and wanted to thank you, Mr. Gibson, for the audit updates and the audit presentation. Thank you for your good work. Up next is our disaster procurement update.
Mr. Burdine, there have not been any changes since I reported last month.
All right, thank you, sir. Next, we have the co-teach update.
All right, Dr. Hill, if you'd come and bring us up to date on the co-teach Year 2 implementation.
Good evening, President Burdine and board members and Dr. Dupree. I come to you tonight to talk to you about the co-teach update. As you recall, this is our second full year of implementation, and so we're going to review some of the data tonight and talk about our student outcomes, and then talk about what's next for the coming school year. So first of all, one thing that's exciting is when we started looking at our co-teach data last year, and we gave you a report at the end of the year last year in July, we were only monitoring a group of students in co-teach. We weren't monitoring all of the students. So this year, in the information that we're going to be providing to you, every single student that was in a co-teach classroom, the general ed student and the special ed student, the data we're going to talk to or report on tonight is included. So we've expanded our monitoring group, so we think that's exciting. So first of all, this slide is talking about the composition of a co-teach classroom. And the reason this is important is because the research says that when you look at a co-teach classroom, when you have one general ed teacher and one special education teacher teaching bell to bell, the entire instructional period, your composition of students is important. And so the best practice of the rule of thumb is that you have no more than 30% of the students in the classroom are identified as students receiving special education services. One thing that's important for us to monitor this is to also think about some of the other students in the classroom that may have other needs as well. And so although, and I'll give you an example, if you look at the elementary here, you see in overall elementary classroom, co-teach classrooms had 24% special ed, middle school 28%, and high school 19%. The middle school classroom is a little bit concerning, particularly if, you know, you had 16% of those students were, in addition to special ed, you had 16% were students that were also limited English proficient. Now, those kids could be the same special ed students because, you know, they can be identified with both programs. The point here